Every monster believes no one saw. Every monster is wrong. There are villages west of Chicagoland where time seems to move differently, places where grain silos cast long shadows across endless cornfields, where church bells still ring on Sunday mornings, and where everyone knows the name of every family that has lived there for generations. The roads are quiet, the nights are darker than they should be. And if you ask the older residents long enough, they'll eventually tell you every village has a watcher. Most people assume they're talking about a sheriff or an old widow who notices everything. They aren't. By every account, Calvin Mercer was an ordinary man. He repaired lawnmowers, he sharpened knives, he mowed his grass every Thursday at exactly 6 in the evening. He attended church often enough that people recognized him, but rarely enough that no one really knew him. His smile never reached his eyes. Children avoided walking in front of his house. Dogs pulled their owners across the street. Cats froze whenever they wandered into his yard. Nobody could explain why. Some people simply carry a darkness that others instinctively recognize. No one ever witnessed Calvin Mercer commit a crime, not one. There were no fingerprints, no blood, no eyewitnesses, no surviving victims, only disappearances. A traveling salesman whose truck was found abandoned near the interstate. A college student who never returned home after visiting friends. A hitchhiker, a florist delivering arrangements to a farmhouse. A mechanic, a drifter. Over nearly 30 years, people vanished. Investigators came. Questions were asked, reports were filed, families mourned, life continued. Calvin Mercer remained, patient, quiet, invisible. His basement was immaculate. Concrete walls, metal shelves, a rusted floor drain, the smell of bleach permanently soaked into the air. Everything had a place, every tool, every bottle, every rag folded perfectly. He believed order erased guilt. He believed careful planning erased evil. He believed that perfection left no witnesses. He was almost right. The Raven arrived during an unusually cold October. It landed on the old telephone pole across from Calvin's farmhouse just before sunrise. It didn't caw. It didn't hunt. It simply watched. When Calvin left for work, the bird watched. When he returned, the bird watched. When darkness settled across the fields, the bird remained, watching. Neighbors joked about it. Guess you've made yourself a friend. Maybe it thinks you're feeding it. Strangest bird I've ever seen. Calvin laughed politely, but every time he looked toward the telephone pole, the raven was staring directly at him. One evening he threw a stone, the bird stepped aside, never looked away. The next morning he fired a warning shot. The raven lifted into the air, circled once, and returned to the exact same spot, watching. Weeks passed. Then came the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Not against the front door, not against the bedroom window, the basement window. Calvin grabbed a flashlight. The basement was empty until he turned toward the small window near the ceiling. Outside, the raven stood on the frozen ground, looking directly inside. Its black eyes reflected the beam of his flashlight without moving. He closed the curtain. The tapping stopped. Morning brought something impossible. Resting perfectly centered on his front porch was a white button, old, cracked, slightly stained. Calvin's heart stopped. He knew that button. It had belonged to a wool coat worn by a young woman who disappeared nearly 3 winters earlier. He remembered cutting it away before destroying everything. Everything. There should have been nothing left. He buried the button 20 miles away. The next morning, it waited on his porch. He threw it into the Fox River. The following day, it rested on his kitchen table, dry. Beside it lay one black feather. The raven watched from the telephone pole. Soon the gifts became worse. A silver bracelet, a child's toy truck, a driver's license, a wedding ring, a broken wristwatch. Each belonged to someone whose disappearance had become another cold case. Each item had been destroyed, hidden, burned, buried, impossible to recover. Yet somehow they returned, always accompanied by a single black feather, always after the raven appeared. Sleep abandoned him. He filled notebooks with everything he could learn about ravens, ancient folklore, Native American traditions, Norse mythology, Scottish legends. Every culture seemed to describe ravens the same way, keepers of memory, messengers between worlds, witnesses to the dead, collectors of forgotten truths. He slammed every book shut. Superstition. It had to be superstition. Then he made a mistake. He followed the bird across harvested fields, over frozen creeks, into an abandoned cemetery where weathered stones leaned beneath ancient oak trees. The raven landed atop a crumbling angel statue. At its feet rested a photograph. Calvin picked it up. His hands began shaking. It showed him standing beside a man who had disappeared nearly 20 years earlier, both of them smiling. There had never been photographs. He had made certain of that. He screamed until his voice disappeared. The raven never moved. Winter settled across northern Illinois. The villagers whispered that Calvin had changed. His curtains remained closed. He argued with empty fields. Sometimes he stood in his yard screaming into the sky. Children stopped using the sidewalk in front of his home altogether. Even adults hurried past. Then the raven disappeared. 3 days passed. Calvin laughed for the first time in months. He slept. He cleaned his basement. He believed the nightmare had ended. On the fourth morning, every rooftop in the village was covered in ravens. Hundreds, church steeples, telephone wires, barn roofs, fence posts. Thousands of black eyes looked toward one house. Calvin's. Only one raven flew, the original. It landed in his yard carrying something larger than ever before. A human skull, weathered, broken above the left eye, exactly where Calvin remembered striking it decades earlier. He collapsed. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as Calvin begged the bird, "I'm sorry, I buried them. You can't know. You weren't there. You weren't supposed to see." Someone called the sheriff. Deputies found Calvin kneeling in his front yard, speaking to the skull, while hundreds of ravens surrounded the property in complete silence. When officers approached, Calvin pointed toward the original raven. His voice cracked with terror. "It knows. It watched. It keeps bringing everything back. You have to arrest it." Instead, they arrested him. For 14 straight hours, Calvin Mercer confessed, not because detectives trapped him, not because they discovered evidence, not because witnesses came forward. He confessed because he could no longer bear the idea that somewhere, someone remembered every single thing he had done. Maps filled with burial locations, descriptions of abandoned wells, old barns, creeks, woodlots, places no one had searched. The investigators found nearly every one. Families finally received answers after decades of wondering. Calvin Mercer died before ever standing trial. The official report listed heart failure. Prison guards told another story. Every morning, without fail, a lone raven perched outside the narrow window of his cell, watching. Calvin stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped speaking to anyone except the bird. The night he died, guards heard him screaming. When they opened the cell, there was no sign of violence, only terror frozen across his face. Resting on his chest was one perfect black feather. The feather disappeared from the evidence locker 3 days later. No locks were broken, no fingerprints were found, no explanation was ever offered. The farmhouse was eventually demolished. A newer home stands there today. Families drive past without knowing what once happened beneath that roof. But every October, when the corn turns gold and the evenings grow quiet, a single raven returns. It lands atop the old telephone pole that somehow survived everything else. It never calls. It never flies away. It simply watches the village below, waiting, perhaps for another monster, perhaps for another secret, or perhaps to remind us all of something we desperately want to believe isn't true. People can lie. Evidence can disappear. Time can bury almost anything. But somewhere above every lonely road, there may always be a watcher, and the watcher never forgets. Share this chilling tale with someone who appreciates a good mystery that lingers.